Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see you tonight. We are so happy that you came out to join Messy Modernism. And my name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Norman Rockwell Museum. And we really have a wonderful program for you titled Messy Modernism, Art in 20th Century Magazines. This event is organized by the Norman Rockwell Museum's Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies in conjunction with Rockwell Center Senior Fellow Erica Doss and three outstanding scholars, Leo G. Mazow, Emily Hage, and Melissa Wren. Our program this evening is one in a series of Rockwell Center conversations about the power of published art and its ongoing impact and influence in society and culture. Tonight we'll begin with an introduction by Erica Doss, an art historian and professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Her wide-ranging interests in American art are reflected in her publications and public lectures, which examine the complexities of modern and contemporary American visual material culture. She has written widely, and her books include Benton, Pollock and the Politics of Modernism, From Regionalism to Abstract Expressionism, Spirit Poles and Flying Pigs, Public Art and Cultural Democracy in American Communities, Elvis Culture, Fans, Faith and Images, American Art of the 20th and 21st Centuries, and Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America. Erica is co-editor of the Culture America series at University Press of Kansas, and she has served on the editorial boards of American Quarterly, American Art, Memory Studies, and Public Art Dialogue. We will look forward to your questions and comments, and we invite you to share those in the chat as we go. And I'm now very pleased to turn the program over to Erica Doss.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for, we're just going to keep saying this panel, Messy Modernism, Art in 20th Century American Magazines. The panel is being organized, as Stephanie said, by the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies at the Norman Rockwell Museum. And I want to thank museum curator Stephanie Plunkett and museum staff Rich Bradway and Mary Burrell for their help in making this panel and these afternoon presentations possible. Housed in the Norman Rockwell Museum, the Rockwell Center supports research and scholarship on the art of modern American illustration. It's the ideal host for our panel this afternoon, which features three talks on three American artists: Edward Hopper, whose work we see on the left, Minnie Okubo on the right, and Saul Steinberg, and the illustrations that they made for various magazines from the 19-teens through the 1960s. Reclaiming the illustrative work of both well-known and understudied artists, the purpose of this panel is to show the complex relationships among artists, corporations, and magazines in the 20th century, and thereby broaden the parameters of American modernism. Magazines remain relatively unexplored sites where new understandings of the dynamics between fine art and mass culture were developed. Throughout the 20th century, multiple American periodicals with diverse niche audiences and agendas commissioned multiple American artists to illustrate covers and feature stories. These commissions have mostly, I think, been ignored in histories of American modernism, and this panel takes up those dynamics in three case studies: Edward Hopper's covers for the Wells Fargo Messenger, Minnie Okubo's drawings, which appeared in Fortune magazine, and Saul Steinberg's work for magazines beyond the New Yorker, including Life, Look, Sports Illustrated, and Time. Our speakers explore the origins of and motivations behind such commissions, analyzing the art as it was originally produced and published, and showing how advertisements, adjacent articles, and captions shaped the initial reception and understanding of these works. The often incongruous juxtaposition then of images, text, and ads reveal a messy or messier modernism, a more complicated, nuanced, and expansive cultural landscape than is often described or translated. As such, they offer important insights into the convergences of financial, social, cultural, and political forces in the making of modern American art and art history. Leo Mazo, our first speaker, is the Louise B. and J. Harwood Cochran Curator of American Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Author of the Eldridge Prize-winning book Thomas Hart Benton and the American Sound, and editor of Picturing the Banjo. Leo organized the exhibition Edward Hopper in the American Hotel at the VMFA in 2019-2020. He's presently organizing the exhibition book, The Art of the American Guitar, for the museum, and this will travel to the Frisch Museum of Art and an additional venue in 2022-2023. Leo's talk today is titled Edward Hopper and the Wells Fargo Way. Emily Haig is our second speaker, and she is Associate Professor of Art History at St. Joseph's University. A specialist in 20th century art and magazines, Emily's new book, Dada Magazines, The Making of a Movement, was just published in January by Bloomsbury. Her current book project is The Art of Fortune, 1930 to 1970. Emily's article, Reconfiguring Race, Recontextualizing the Media, Romery Bearden's 1968 Fortune and Time covers, was published in Art Journal in 2016. And her talk today is titled Objectivity in Wartime USA, in Okubo and Fortune magazine. Our third speaker, Melissa Wren, is Collections Manager, Harvard Business School Art and Artifacts Collection. Her many publications on American art, illustration, and magazines include essays on Art in Life magazine, including a terrific article on Life's use of color reproductions, and also an article on Saul Steinberg's mural for the 1958 Brussels World's Fair. Melissa is co-editor with Monica E. Jovanovic of Corporate Patronage of Art and Architecture in the United States from the late 19th century to the present, and this was published in 2019. Her talk today is titled Beyond the New Yorker, Saul Steinberg's Other Magazine Commissions. Following these three talks, we will open the Zoom webinar to questions and comments from the audience, as Stephanie suggested. So if you have them, please write your questions in the chat area of your screen and we will moderate them accordingly. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker this afternoon, Leo Mazo.
Erica, okay, thank you all so very much for being here. Erica, thank you for shepherding us all in this together, and I second Erica's heartfelt appreciation of the efforts of the Rockwell Center, Rockwell Museum, and of course, Mary, Rich, and Stephanie. Thank you so very much for facilitating this. From 1916 through 1918, Edward Hopper produced 3 front covers, 9 back covers, and 19 additional illustrations for the Wells Fargo Messenger, an in-house periodical featuring contemporary news, company notices, prose, and musings on Wells Fargo history. In mid-1918, when the federal government began consolidating express businesses to facilitate war efforts and combined Wells Fargo with the American Railway Express Company, Hopper survived the merger and contributed additional illustrations for the almost identical new magazine with a similar name, the Express Messenger. From about 1905 through 1925, Hopper, in fact, worked for several business and trade publications, but he had a particularly close relationship with Wells Fargo Messenger, for which he also illustrated brochures. As the nation approached and then entered the First World War, the company developed a much ballyhooed philosophy called, quote, the Wells Fargo way, which emphasized productivity, reliability, punctuality, and honesty. Merging time-honored republicanism and Fordist efficiency, the Wells Fargo way exerted a powerful influence within this powerful and rapidly growing company. Hopper's illustrations matched the regimentation, consistency, and standardization, which, tempered with dependability and courteous service, comprised the Wells Fargo way. But these sources also show Hopper giving concrete form to abstract concepts of duration, time, and expressive feeling, and the psychological dynamics of commercial exchange. Hopper's Wells Fargo drawings, that is, match the experiential or affective emphasis of much American modernism. Wells Fargo began as an express company in 1852, an alternative to the slow, pricey, and unpredictable early US post office. The company frequently shipped money, and over the following decades, it exponentially grew as both a bank and a postal service. In the early 1860s, a Pony Express that lasted only 18 months, but operated a Pony Express that lasted only 18 months, but provided a romanticized, much hyped mythology that helped propel the company into one of the nation's largest corporations. By 1916, Wells Fargo had 9,171 offices across the US and employed over 25,000 individuals. The 19 teens were good to Wells Fargo. A 7% dividend in 1914 skyrocketed to 39% in 1916. In attaining this commercial success, Wells Fargo relied on in-house monthly publications. From the 1860s through the early 1900s, the company published the Wells Fargo Banker. In 1915, it launched Business Outlook, exploring banking and related economic matters. But the company had special plans for the Messenger, which commenced in September of 1912. Edward Hungerford, the company's advertising manager and a prolific travel writer, edited the Messenger until it morphed with the Express Messenger in 1919. In the first Wells Fargo Messenger, company president Burns Caldwell wrote that the publication aimed, quote, to raise the company's standard of efficiency and usefulness by the promotion of higher ideals of individual attainment and mutual accomplishment, adding that it sought to secure unity of aim and effort. And historians generally agree that the magazine aimed to facilitate connectedness and consensus building. Hopper contributed to this effort through his early line drawings beginning in the April 1916 issue. Up until February of 1917, they accompanied stories, prose, and adages. In My Santa Claus, the standing Wells Fargo delivery man becomes, quote, the very latest Santa, dwarfing the seated cigar-smoking father in his easy chair. In the late 19-teens, the company rarely missed an opportunity to rhyme or otherwise insert Fargo Way or Wells Fargo Way, seen in the poems here. At left, we know from the verse it's the day before Christmas, and the clock atop the mantle drives home the shibboleths of promptness and reliability, while the stooping delivery man points to the company's care with packages entrusted to them. These images visualize the mandate to get goods to customers on time. Driving home the message are clocks and other devices, including call cards alerting horses and riders to stop. The world of wagons, of course, was already eclipsed by that of automobiles, but this drawing reminds us of a vast logistics network, one on which a populace intimated at left depends. Hopper's illustration here tops a full page, the inside front cover of the February 19 Wells Fargo Messenger. The text states that the automatic call card signal is even quicker than a telephone call. It is a wireless messenger that flags our wagon as it passes the door, and the package starts on its way instantly. As we see it right, Wells Fargo outsourced and relied on scales like clocks, signs of measurement and precision. In visualizing the Wells Fargo way of order, Regulation and Efficiency, Hopper's drawing on the inside back cover from June 1917 shows a scale at the window of a Wells Fargo Express office. Its long hand is set at 0, whereas the angled hand on the clock, cropped at top left, suggests a time of 4 p.m. The same configuration appears on Hopper's April 1918 cover. While the 4 p.m. clock touches the G in the title, the scale set at 0 is seen between the two men at left. The clocks alert us to the importance of time and the accountability and conscientiousness undergirding the Wells Fargo way. They also remind us that the topic was on the government's mind precisely when Hopper produced this cover. In late March 1918, Congress passed the Daylight Saving Standard Time Act as a means to save electricity and to maximize daily working hours. Unsurprisingly, most of Hopper's Wells Fargo Messenger drawings drive home the point that the company is doing its part for the war. Both covers here concern WSS, War Saving Stamps. As the line drawing at left shows, Hopper gave visual form in these works to the supposed thrift panacea, yet the clock, scales, and railroads point most frequently to the larger themes of time and efficiency. But no such mechanism need be present to invoke the courtesy, productivity, honesty, and promptness in the Wells Fargo way. The story, Safe, Sure, and Speedy Service, narrates the dishonest Whistle and Dan Joyce, who you see here, who have long picked through boxes before they reach their intended recipients. Hopper's illustration dramatizes the moment when 3 officers expose a crate from which he has plundered, prompting Joyce's conversion experience. This starts with him replacing the stolen merchandise, but leads to Whistle and Dan Joyce becoming Mr. Dan Joyce, a Wells Fargo freight agent. Like a progressive era reform movement, the Wells Fargo way is here a path to self-improvement. This logic held that by working hard, being honest, and striving for order and efficiency, one could wend one's way through the world, or at least up brownstone residences, as we see here. Believing that the Wells Fargo way is more than a mere phrase, Wells Fargo advanced visual analogs of the idea, linking these behaviors and character traits with company-advancing results. Some illustrations followed like this before and after formats, contrasting sloppiness with careful and tidy organization, dubbed, of course, the Wells Fargo way. A messenger from the company's northern division proposed a logo, which when read suggests another pithy couplet poem. Roman numerals comprising the face of a clock surround the squared circle and suggest the reliability and conscientiousness inherent in the Wells Fargo way. And then there were Fargo Way clubs, which advanced these ideas in all large cities and dozens of small towns. Members were coerced into signing a Wells Fargo Way pledge. In late 1916, the company produced a film called Courtesy and Efficiency, the Wells Fargo way. Hopper's covers for Wells Fargo Messenger used dynamic compositions and restricted color palettes to articulate this way. Transparency and order were central to the philosophy, and clarity amidst chaos might be considered a visual analog of this philosophy. In the March 1917 cover, Hopper stabilizes the many parts, horse's wagon, agent, hotel facade, column, signage, into a coherent whole. Similarly, the Wells Fargo agent is in control of his horses as he strokes the forehead of the animal at left. As in his drawings, the covers have recurring characters and formal devices, such as lateral cropping to suggest a snapshot within a world of flux, and continuity from the world of the cover into that of the Wells Fargo employee holding the periodical in his or her hands. Some of the images suggest narrative continuity. The figure on the inside cover of the March 1917 issue repeats the profile, cap, and coat from the front cover, as if he went to the brownstone after making his delivery at the hotel at left. A Marine, so identified by his cinched coat and standard issue campaign hat, says goodbye to his family in a Hopper illustration to a poem called Your Boy and Mine. The uniform, lean build, and young face identify the same soldier in Hopper's illustration on the back of this issue. It's as if we have scene 1, the family sends him off. Scene 2, he shows his love for family and alerts them of his safety by sending a Wells Fargo money order. We find similar clarity in Hopper's illustration on the back cover of the February 19 issue, depicting American soldiers outside Société Générale, a well-known Paris bank. With this drawing, the firm asserts its partnership with the bank, as well as that institution's role in giving agent soldiers a central site for traveler's checks, mails, and general banking, joining the hotel with sign cropped at right and announcing a home away from home in Paris. Wells Fargo repurposed the poster as the front of a 6-page brochure with maps showing its outposts in Paris. Curiously, Hopper's name, which appears at lower right on the magazine cover, was almost dropped, very faint to see in the brochure version, and this does not even appear in the pamphlet's listing in the government's catalog of copyright entries. Matching the patriotic lingo that escalated as the US neared intervention in the war, the Wells Fargo Messenger in June 1917 opined that, quote, "He who serves Wells Fargo also serves his country very well indeed." And Hopper's inside back cover for that issue carried a similar caption. The artist adapted his intelligible, user-friendly style to the depiction of what would come to be called a war garden or victory garden. Yet another June 1917 article explained the sacrifices of Wells Fargo employees were making, turning their lawns into small farms, and included a less romanticized photograph version of Hopper's drawing, matching the small family, man with hoe, and surrounding neighborhood. As entry into war became imminent, the magazine carried stories about Fargo war gardens, urging its readers to grow their own food. Further research might attend to the relationship of Hopper's illustration to these corresponding articles and illustrations, but for now, we can summarize that the cover joins the artist's other image in adapting the Wells Fargo way to popular patriotic impulses. The larger study that I'm working on, from which this material comes, also positions Hopper's scene within a tradition extending from the Book of Isaiah through Wenzel Homer's Veteran in a New Field, pairing farmer citizens with soldiers, with Hopper's farmer shedding his Wells Fargo cap and Homer's veteran putting aside his canteen. This comparison might be of particular interest. Shortly before the war-related covers and interior illustrations, Hopper began a series of images grouping a woman, dog, and African-American servant. Wells Fargo used the 6 illustrations to advertise checks and traveler's checks. The woman, who came to be called the Wells Fargo girl, a not so distant cousin of the Brinkley girl or the Gibson girl, first appeared in an advertisement in the front cover of the May 1917 Wells Fargo Messenger. On the inside back cover of the same issue, she holds a walking stick, leading the spotted greyhound, an African-American man, in our direction, leaving behind for just a moment the entirely vexing matter of how Hopper miniaturizes the man in relation to the dog, having him follow behind an animal. One might wonder just who the intended audience is for this image. Is it the 25,000 Wells Fargo employees, many of whom could not afford the leisure life of the Wells Fargo girl in the first place? An article about this figure, appearing 2 months later, gives a few answers. Accompanying the story is Hopper's latest visualization of her. She looks at us, the dog looks to the left, and the eyes of the porter, carrying golf clubs and a coat, are hidden beneath his hat. While the article is not about Hopper per se, the caption, "The girl who appears in our traveler's checks ads," underscores the artist's active role in facilitating the fortunes of a national conglomerate. Noting that she recurs in magazines and booklets, on wagon posters, a small card reproduction, as well as a large picture of her in a handsome frame. The article was, of course, entitled "Boosting Our Travelers' Checks," and speculated that the Fargo girl pictures would help, quote, boost sales this year. And indeed, the appearance and distribution of that framed reproduction of the Fargo girl by Hopper is suggested in his back cover illustration, as you can see here, in the March 19 Wells Fargo Messenger, where that earlier version of the figure appears on the wall at left, right there. Accompanying the phrase, on her travels, she uses Wells Fargo checks, a drawing of the woman-man-dog trio appeared also in a Messenger illustration at left and on the cover of a 5-panel brochure for salesmen to distribute to prospective clients at right. The magazine may have lightened the figure's skin tone in the brochure version. What is clear, however, is that Hopper and his employer take for granted a racial and animal hierarchy, from women to dog to finally African-American man. Hopper's brochure cover appears as well on a page highlighting its 4 traveler's check pamphlets, with text affirming that the Fargo girl about to leave on vacation will now have convenience and protection. There can be little doubt of the white intended customer here. Segregation and discrimination reigned in hospitality services well into the Cold War years, and the railways, with the railways becoming agents of Jim Crow policy. Not until 1936, with the beginning of the so-called Green Books, would African-American travelers begin to experience anything like such convenience and protection. Nor should I be surprised that after a few years of combing through all things Wells Fargo Messenger, Hopper's porter, like the Wells Fargo girl, a fiction obviously, is the only African-American I've seen, photographed or drawn in the magazine. What is a bit surprising are the lengths to which the editor, Edward Hungerford, went to enlist Hopper's Wells Fargo girl in support of the Fargo Way. Intentionally or unwittingly, the magazine used the artist's narrative clarity and stylistic legibility to naturalize a racially coded, socially, economically structured way. Like Hopper himself, the Wells Fargo girl was multitasking. She helped sell banking services, and she did so in a nation on the brink of war. The US entered the war a month after the image at left appeared. Throughout his Wells Fargo work, the artist emphasized individual subjective responses to modernity, the modernity of commerce, banking, travel, and war. Intimated by the 2 workers signaling to each other here, the Wells Fargo Way foregrounded that punctuality, cooperation, and conscientiousness, anything to get the trunk to its destination on time. It would be difficult to underestimate the ramifications of Hopper's work for the Messenger. It's here that he first encountered editor Hungerford, who launched the publication in 1912. After World War I, Hungerford edited Tavern Topics and hired the artist to produce illustrations that became the basis for later paintings. Comparing the steeply angled overhanging roofs at left and window at left and right, one can find in these images the genesis of his later architectural designs. The Wells Fargo illustrations recur in uncannily close fashion, and their presence is felt for a long time. For example, decorative tiles circumscribing a desk marked by wainscoting and a clerk for the Hopper 1918 cover are found later in his 1943 hotel lobby. Hopper also crops a clock within a lobby in both works, signaling the waiting, boredom, passing of time, and other experiential foundations of American modernism. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Our next speaker will be Emily.
So hello, everyone, and thank you to Erica, Leo, and Melissa, to the Norman Rockwell Museum, and to all of you for being here at this event. In April 1944, Fortune magazine published 17 drawings by artist Minya Okubo of her experiences in an assembly center at Japanese internment camp during World War II. These sketches are best known from her book, Citizen 13660, named after her assigned ID number, published in 1946, where over 200 of them appeared with her captions. However, they were reproduced 2 years earlier in Fortune. A little background on Okubo. She was born in 1912 in California. Her parents were immigrants from Japan. After studying at Cal Berkeley and a trip to Europe on a scholarship, in 1939, she was employed by the Federal Arts Project and worked with Diego Rivera on his mural for the 1940 Golden Gate International Exposition. In 1940 and 41, the San Francisco Museum of Art, now the SF MoMA, held 2 exhibitions of Okubo's gouaches. But everything changed for her after Pearl Harbor and Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, requiring all people of Japanese descent into assembly centers and then detention or relocation camps established by the U.S. War Relocation Authority, or the WRA. An estimated 120,000 people were rounded up. 2/3 of them were American citizens. At these camps, internees found little to no privacy, constant surveillance, cramped quarters, and the smell of stagnant sewage. They were kept in with barbed wire and armed guards, and many suffered from illness and depression. On April 26, 1942, Okubo and her brother Toku reported to the Tanforan Assembly Center located at the Tanforan Racetrack in San Bruno, California. They were then sent to the Central Utah Relocation Camp in Topaz, Utah. While at these sites, Okubo created many compositions in charcoal and gouache that made the suffering and confinement of internees impossible to avoid. She also published drawings in a small internal magazine at Topaz called Trek, which she had co-founded and where she was art editor. One of these drawings for Trek changed her life. It caught the eye of someone at Fortune, probably Deborah Calkins, the assistant art director. In October 1943, Okubo received a telegram from Fortune inviting her to do illustration for their forthcoming issue on Japan. After she accepted, Fortune facilitated Okubo's release from the camp in January 1944 and her move to an apartment in Greenwich Village, where she remained until she died in 2001. For the April 1944 issue of Fortune, Okubo was commissioned to draw 8 illustrations, many showing life in Japan, even though she'd never been there. In the same publication, a selection of her drawings of camp life, which were not commissioned, were put to work as illustrations for a 9-page article, Issei Nisei Kibei, referring to those imprisoned at the internment camps. That is, Issei, Japanese people who were the first generation to immigrate to the US, Nisei, children of Japanese immigrants who were born in the US, and Kibei, Japanese Americans born in the US who returned after receiving their education in Japan. The article has no byline, which is typical in Fortune, but likely was written collaboratively by Harriman Moore, a former English instructor in China who was on Fortune's staff, as well as diplomat and later scholar Claude Buss, journalist Shelley Meidens, and photographer Carl Meidens, all 3 of whom had recently returned from being held at internment camps run by Japan in Manila. It's notable that the article was published at all, but I found it to be equivocal at best, at times confusing and contradictory. On the one hand, it is critical of American internment camps, yet it goes relatively easy on the government, sometimes even defending its policies and practices, arguing that the US was much more humane than Japan in its treatment of prisoners. In the accompanying pictures, we find Okubo, usually identifiable through her patterned shirt, typically at least 2 figures in the foreground, with the rest of the composition showing their circumstances. Fortune describes these drawings as, quote, a document remarkable for humor, poignant observation, and above all, objectivity, end quote. The editors congratulate Okubo for representing facts without being consumed by personal feelings, particularly angry or accusatory ones. Fortune's insistence that Okubo's pictures were objective may have been motivated by a well-founded belief that images of internment by a former internee ran the risk of being seen as non-objective. They may have been trying to prevent accusations of bias against the US government. Letters to the editor for the issue, and almost all were about the article and the drawings, demonstrate that their concerns were well-founded. A San Francisco subscriber fumed, the article was written by a Japanese, by one who hasn't the interest of our country at heart, or by one who is being reimbursed for his efforts by the Japanese government. A Mr. Walter Wright protested about the internees. Darn it all, I resent all this fuss about them. They aren't faring a bit worse than we are. Are we going to get our jobs back? We have a lot to worry about too. But the rest of the content of the April 1944 issue of Fortune described below and the way Fortune treated Okubo's sketches suggests that more than being careful about others' reactions, the editors found that Okubo's images did not significantly interfere with the magazine's goal of treating the subject of Japan in a way they called objective. Fortune's editors made every effort to frame Okubo's sketches as objective. They chose which images to include, opting out of ones like this, where Okubo is sticking her tongue out at a house captain. They also wrote captions in the distancing third person. The impact is clear here. Fortune's caption reads, "All people of Japanese blood were carted off to custody." In Citizen 13660, on the other hand, Okubo conveys that they were treated like animals. "We were unloaded with our goods." The style of the drawings, the presence of Okubo in each one, and their narrative nature may be a reference to the manga tradition in Japan, which includes a broad range of genres, not only comedy. The way that Fortune reproduces them in ribbons 3 across reinforces this interpretation. But for Fortune readers, these qualities would likely have called to mind American comics, thus possibly contributing to their assessment of the drawings as humorous. And I'm curious if others are reminded of comics here. But interpretations of Okubo's sketches as objective and humorous ignore so much. Let's start with objective. The images, in fact, are quite subjective. Indeed, in most of them, she pictures her subjectivity. Since she is in these frames, what she presents cannot be what she saw, but she shows us her experiencing and witnessing various situations. The drawings remind viewers that we are looking through her eyes. Her depictions of camp life communicate that she is sharing her take on events and remind viewers that this is all anyone, including magazine editors, can offer. As Christine Hong points out, Okubo was also thinking of the outside viewer's perspective. She is a medium of sorts, giving audiences access to what she saw. More than subjective, the images are subversive. Documenting her experiences at all was confrontational. During the war, the government was trying to control representations of the camps by forbidding photography, censoring print materials, and staging and editing visual depictions to conceal inconsistency with US rhetoric regarding justice and democracy. Okubo was also countering the proliferation of racist anti-Japanese images during the war. You don't have to go beyond Fortune to find examples. This spread features caricatures by Miguel Covarrubias, and a Heppenstall ad promotes one of their posters, which depicts a snarling man with green skin, backed by many of the same under the Japanese military flag. It reads, "If you worked as hard and fast as a Jap, we'd smash Tokyo a lot quicker." Concerning humor, Okubo did include humor in her sketches, but rather than a bitter, free humor, making light of the hardships and injustices internees faced, hers highlights the absurdity and incongruity of her circumstances. In this drawing, we see a billboard encouraging viewers, it's right here, to enjoy Acme beer, though of course the guards and fences prevented internees from enjoying much at all. Okubo's later caption in Citizen 13660 explains that the sign was quite a joke to the thirsty evacuees, especially on the warm days. Recalling things like singing "God Bless America" with guards around holding shotguns, Okubo reflected, "So many crazy things happened in the camp. So the joke and humor I saw in the camp was not in a joyful sense, but ridiculous and insane." Okubo's humor was serious, and the hardships are all there to see in what she drew. Her humor was disarming too. Readers seemed relieved by it, and thus more receptive to her images. Okubo's drawings are far from in-your-face attacks against the government or an unrelenting expose of the camps. Given what she'd been through, one might think that she would not hold back at all. Why be so subtle? I've talked some of the hostile environment she faced, but the articles, ads, and illustrations in the April 1944 issue of Fortune directly bear out what Okubo said about the climate of 1940s USA, when, as she put it, everything that was Japanese was still rat poison. In the introduction to the April 1944 issue of Japan, the editors lay out its purpose, namely to offer what they call, quote, "sound public information on Japan," end quote. At the same time, however, in the table of contents, they call Japan a military power we must defeat and a Pacific problem we must solve. Despite the plethora of graphs, maps, photographs, and articles, the issue is by no means a just the facts publication. One article talks of paradoxes of behavior that have twisted the Japanese mind for centuries. It goes on to describe Japanese men who, quote, "raped Chinese women and twisted bayonets in their breasts and bowels," end quote. An ad for the Kohlmorgen Optical Corporation singles the Japanese out for attack in dehumanizing terms. It reads, Laden with plundered spoil of ravaged Asia, a Jap merchantman steals home like the thief it is. Such clearly anti-Japanese content bears out what journalist Ramona Martinez has said about what is typically called objectivity, that in fact it is the ideology of the status quo. The Cole Morgan ad actually faces a page of the article Issei Nisei Kibe, which brings us to the placement of the article and Okubo's drawings. Feature articles on Japan in this issue are printed on expensive, thick, heavy woven matte paper chosen for its capacity to present high quality reproductions of artwork in color. The article and Okubo's drawings, on the other hand, are printed on cheap, thin, glossy white pages among the advertisements and jumps that sandwich the thicker, now brown pages. And I'm going to show that to you. You can see it. There's brown and white, and the white is the ads, and the brown is the feature articles. And although Issei Nisei Kibe is the first article, the table of contents lists it after the feature stories. The article is easy to miss. Besides marginalizing the story, this treatment exposes the discontent between the concerns of white American consumers and those of Japanese American internees. To give but two examples, a page of the article faces an ad for Barrett's Building Supplies. It begins, "1/3 of this nation still lives in comfortless, inefficient, unhealthy homes," a statement that more accurately describes the housing in the camps. On page 118, an ad promises shirts and colors that are individually made to personal requirements, perfectly fitted, finest of workmanship, hand finished throughout. This page also presents a drawing by Okubo showing women wearing worn and oversized cataloged, ordered, and GI clothes. Okubo was all too familiar with such disconnects and with the media attack on people of Japanese descent. In one image, she surrounds herself with the words that bombarded her daily life. "Sorry, no Japs, send them back to Tojo," and "dangerous criminals," as well as a small drawing right here labeled, "A Jap looks like this." In such a climate, she could not blatantly speak out against the US government's internment policies. In 1981, Okubo told the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, "So I just kept a record of everything, objective and humorous, without saying much so they could see it all." Rather than confirming others' misguided interpretations of her works, here she was, I think, explaining how going along with others' interpretations of her images enabled her to bring the realities of the camps to coffee tables and corporate lobbies and CEOs' living rooms. Her strategy was successful. Her pictures were published in Fortune, and besides the negative letters to the editor mentioned earlier, a smaller group of letters was very positive. In 1944, the article was published as a booklet. And in 1944 and 45, an exhibition called Paintings and Drawings of War Relocation Centers by Mine Okubo traveled from New York City to San Francisco, Pasadena, and Seattle. And I welcome people's thoughts on how differently people would have understood these images on gallery walls versus in the magazine. Okubo's sketches then were reproduced, of course, in Citizen 13660 in 1946, alongside her own captions. Her success was due in part to the fact that by the mid-40s, the WRA was actually joining forces with anti-incarceration activists to encourage assimilation. A big part of accomplishing this goal was humanizing those who had been imprisoned, emphasizing their American character. They promoted Okubo's drawings of camp life, the upbeat attitude of which suited their purposes perfectly. As I've tried to show, Okubo's images are subjective and subversive in the face of a changing but still largely hostile environment. The magazine makes this context unavoidable. We find here history as it was unfolding, a messy modernism, a fascinating mashup of what she was up against in the same publication as her critical sketches. In 1981, she submitted the April 1944 issue of Fortune as part of her testimony. And decades earlier, in 1944, she recognized that a magazine, even a business magazine, could function as an artistic venue and as a site where artworks could reach observant audiences and potentially incite change. Okubo's drawings remain relevant in the context of ongoing anti-immigrant, anti-Asian racist views and the manipulation of information in the 21st century. They serve as a warning against the bigotry and xenophobia that led to the camps and a challenge to be more perceptive in our readings of images and their makers. As Okubo put it, I hope that things can be learned from this tragic episode, for I believe it could happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. All right, and now we will move to Melissa.
I want to begin by thanking Stephanie Plunkett for the opportunity to be a part of this panel today, to Rich Bradway for his assistance with presenting this talk. I also want to thank Sheila Schwartz of the Saul Steinberg Foundation for her support of my work and for her help with my research and images for this talk today. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel with Erica, Emily, and Leo, especially as it focuses on the key role that magazines have played in the development of modernism, a subject which I have explored in my own work on Life magazine, and also in the recent volume on corporate patronage, which Erica mentioned at the beginning of our introductions. And in that volume, Monica Jovanovic and I pointed out that although Ad Reinhardt, in his 1946 Genealogy of Modern Art, placed corporate patrons, including magazines such as Life and Fortune, in the cornfield graveyard of modern art, such patronage was certainly far from dead. Artist Saul Steinberg accepted many such commissions over the years, creating works in a wide range of media specifically for the magazine page, from pen and ink drawings to watercolors to collages, including commissions from Life, Fortune, and Vogue. Today, I will focus on his post-war commissions that employed collage, and we'll look at how he used the magazine page as a site for experimentation. These commissions gave Steinberg the opportunity to explore the possibilities of color, collage, reproductions, and photography without the restrictions of the 3-column black and white format of the New Yorker. In these innovative works, Steinberg variously used collage to create multisensory and engaging experiences, to push the boundaries of the printed page, and to challenge prevailing principles of photojournalism and advertising. Indeed, even the subjects these commissions depict, from opera to soap operas, traverse the high and low. Born in Romania, Saul Steinberg's first exposure to art was in his father's shop. He always felt lucky, he wrote, to have been born in a college for collages. He described, "My father was a bookbinder. Later, he set up a small factory for cardboard boxes with lots of colored paper and a great supply of glue. The factory had the smell of an artist's studio of collages, as well as the smell of the ink used on large wooded letters to print the ribbons of funeral wreaths." In 1933, Steinberg started studying architecture at the University of Milan, and while still a student, he began contributing cartoons to the Italian newspaper Bertoldo. This was also when Steinberg began experimenting with the medium of collage, as seen in the full-page Panorami di Steinberg in the February 11th, 1938 issue, where someone else's drawing of a foot on brown paper is playfully pasted in the lower left foreground below a panorama of life in a coastal town. Indeed, it is especially fitting that Steinberg came to collage simultaneously through Cubism and newspaper cartoons. It was also in the pages of Bertoldo that Steinberg paid his first public homage to Picasso. In Milan, Steinberg also met Cesare Civita, the former director of periodicals for Mondadori. Through Civita, Steinberg's drawings were published for the first time in the United States in periodicals such as Harper's Bazaar, Town and Country, and Life. Here, for example, is his first publication in Life magazine in the May 27, 1940 issue for a Speaking of Pictures story. Steinberg escaped fascist Italy in 1941 and arrived in the United States in late 1942. He began taking on magazine commissions in 1942, and jobs from advertising agencies arrived as early as 1943, the year he also became a naturalized American citizen. One of Steinberg's earliest American magazine commissions to employ collage was a piece he did for a November 1942 Fortune magazine article on the Selective Service entitled, "Who'll Be Drafted When?" The article opens with the following text. The cartoon on the opposite page reflects what is probably the most frequent subject for conversation and the most frequent cause for worry in millions of American families. To the right of the lengthy text, occupying a slim column of space on the far right of the spread, is a color reproduction of a painting and collage by Steinberg, in which clipped newspaper headlines have been affixed to the surface of a painted red curtain that frames a family seated around a table discussing the topic of the draft. While the family members converse and interact with one another, the pasted paper clippings, as well as the small boy at the lower left of the image and the doll held by the young girl, directly address the reader. Steinberg's colorful image is not merely an illustration, but a conversation with the reader and the adjacent text. It is both in dialogue with the text and draws one's attention away from the text. In fact, the image is as much about distraction as it is about the draft. While three of the small children are pictured in profile, seated on their parents' laps, deeply immersed in the news, the husband anxiously alternates his attention between his wife's words and the newspaper he holds in his hand. Even the parade proceeding just outside their window interrupts the scene, and one can almost hear the sounds of the military procession in the distance. It is important to point out here that Steinberg designed this collage specifically for reproduction on the pages of a magazine. This work engages then not only with the reader and the text of the article, but also the larger modernist discourse on reproduction and distraction, particularly Walter Benjamin's 1935 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Indeed, Steinberg's image exemplifies, to use Benjamin's words, reception and distraction. And the work is a rumination on both modernity and technological reproducibility, as well as how the media influences and shapes perception and reception. Steinberg used these magazine commissions as an opportunity to play with collage and to experiment with reproductions. In a 1945 commission for the magazine Town and Country, for example, Steinberg inserts a brown paper War Department mailing envelope at the center of the image. The pasted paper envelope interrupts both the drawing and the article, drawing attention to both the surface of the magazine page and the artifice of the reproduction. Even though the collaged brown envelope is in the end rendered flat through the process of reproduction, it still fools the eye. The reader may even be compelled to touch the page to confirm whether the surface is raised or slick. This work also recognizes that reading a magazine is inherently multisensory. And rather than using the word reader here, perhaps beholder is a better term for this, as my colleague Jennifer Greenwell has pointed out in her recent work on the illustrator Coles Phillips. Collage is a medium about illusion and representation and the relationship between surface and depth. It is also a medium that is simultaneously visual and tactile. As critic Clement Greenberg observed, viewing a collage is a bodily experience and, like reading a magazine, multisensory. Here, in this collage, Steinberg draws a Christmas tree over and across the envelope and adds a stove at right, with the base of the stove encroaching on and over the envelope's edge, and the stove pipe sliding under the R in corporal, thereby collapsing the distinction between surface and depth, foreground and background. The brown paper envelope is not the only disruption on the page. The branch and needles of the Christmas tree also interrupt the text, literally pushing the column of the words to the right. While this visual intervention might cause the beholder to pause and even look twice before flipping to the next page of the article, it is also a clever nod to the fact that the magazine page itself, like the collage, is a construction, an object that is not only edited, but also arranged. At a moment when illustrated magazines, particularly photographic ones, were associated with objectivity, this mediation by Steinberg exposes their artifice. In a 1946 commission for a Fortune article titled Soap Opera, Steinberg pushes the envelope even further. In this image, a speech bubble filled with color cutouts of sentimental images, labels from soap wrappings, breakfast cereal boxes, and other food products emanates from an ink-drawn radio. Steinberg's soap opera can certainly be read as a critique of post-war consumer society, the cluttered room crammed with bric-a-brac and tangles of wires from toys, lamps, vacuums, irons, and clocks that wind across the floor. Moved to tears by the saga broadcasting from the radio and completely absorbed by the program, as well as the jingles that float above her, the housewife takes a break from her daily duties. While the media here is pictured as a welcome escape for the woman, it is a distraction for her husband, who is shown seated in the other room, looking up from his newspaper and also at the viewer in response. Just as the radio program disrupts his reading, so the collage interrupts the flow of the magazine's spread. Unlike the black and white drawings Steinberg did on the opposite page at the lower right, which both complement and blend in with and are contained by the text, the cacophonous, colorful collage at left stands apart. The incorporation of soap wrappers, as well as the many clippings that variously state ready to eat, thin sliced, cake making, not only slyly reference the content marketing and sponsorships associated with soap operas, but also introduce the senses of taste and smell. The reference to all five senses here, coupled with the incorporation of vernacular materials, can further be read as a response to Clement Greenberg's modernist emphasis on eyesight alone, as well as to hierarchies Greenberg promulgated in his 1939 essay, Avant-Garde and Kitsch. Here, avant-garde and kitsch are shown in tandem, not as separate spheres or in binary opposition. Steinberg was an active participant in mid-century debates on taste, as evidenced by the pictorial comments he did for a 1947 Harper's article by Russell Lines titled The Tastemakers, such as this cartoon where he examines the public's response to abstraction. 2 years later, Life magazine would popularize Russell Lines' theories on highbrow, lowbrow, and middlebrow in an April 11th, 1949 article, which included a chart visualizing the classification of taste by illustrator Tom Funk. The stage photograph of three men who, according to the caption, quote, look at the pictures they prefer, wearing the clothes characteristic of their cultural station, surely inspired Norman Rockwell's own take on the subject, as seen in his cover, The Connoisseur, for the January 13th, 1961 issue of the Saturday Evening Post. In another witty take on the topic of taste, Steinberg creates a drawing and collage of a jukebox for a 1951 Harper's Bazaar article, which brings together pretzels and pearls, candy corn, and paint tubes. Like the sense of taste itself, which is an amalgam of all five senses, this collage combines high and low in a clever comment on tastemakers, fine art, and popular culture. Steinberg's ability to move freely among media and hierarchies is also seen in a series of imaginative interventions he did on or through photographs beginning in the late 1940s and through the early 1950s. In one group of works he produced for the short-lived magazine Flair in 1950, he drew with black ink on photographs of challah, braided bread at left, and crumpled paper at right, transforming the photographed objects into different creatures. The bread becomes a car, the paper a mountain. In another set of images, Steinberg drew on or around real domestic objects and urban buildings, which were then photographed in what amounts to a kind of proto-installation art. Steinberg continued to explore the possibilities of photographic reproductions in a 1954 commission portraying Bertolt Brecht's three-penny opera for Vogue. The magazine text describes the commission, quote, on a shirt cardboard, Steinberg assembled the sad pan crew of cops and robbers. When Steinberg created this three-penny collage, he said, quote, to do something with nothing, that is the real meaning of opera. Using only found things, old paper bags and odd bits from his working reserve of envelopes, theater stubs, hotel bills, he picked out chunks that looked like faces, inking in noses, eyes, and mouths. Most magazine illustrations are designed for reproduction. But in this commission, Steinberg took it a step further. In this work, Steinberg brought together a cast composed of a range of tactile objects, torn fabrics, bottle caps, toast and doilies, all with drawn faces. Like any theater experience, Steinberg's work was ephemeral. These textured and tactile objects were arranged only to be photographed, and in the end, the work exists only in reproduction on the printed page. It is a work about reproduction itself and the relationship of the original to the copy, which is particularly fitting given that it depicts a revival of a theatrical production. The magazine page was clearly a site for experimentation for Steinberg. Magazines also provided opportunities for him to delve into some of his favorite subjects, including baseball. In 1953, Steinberg was sent by Life magazine on the road with the Milwaukee Braves for an assignment. Life regularly hired artists as correspondents, most notably during World War II, and continued the practice in the post-war period, albeit on lighter topics. The baseball press spread, titled Steinberg at the Bat, was published in 1954 and opens with a brilliantly conceived rendering of a catcher, whose protective chest gear began life as a piece of corrugated cardboard. The masking tape that affixes the cardboard to the surface of the paper becomes the straps upon which Steinberg then paints, draws, and pastes additional cutouts and clippings, resulting in a remarkably three-dimensional work. As one can see from looking closely at the original collage shown here, even the textured cardboard and layers of painted tape come through in reproduction on the magazine page. The following pages of the spread are filled with color reproductions of Steinberg's drawings in watercolors of umpires, catchers, pitchers, players on the bench, and the stadium at night. The printed page then is a place for artistic innovation and also where Steinberg's work could be celebrated and seen by millions. Indeed, as curator Joel Smith has written, quote, Steinberg turned the magazine page into a venue for art. Steinberg viewed baseball as the perfect metaphor for America, stating, quote, baseball is an allegorical play about America, a poetic, complex, and subtle play of courage, fear, good luck, mistakes, patience about fate, and sober self-esteem. It is impossible to understand America without a thorough knowledge of baseball. He would return to the subject and the medium of collage in the baseball section of the monumental mural titled The Americans, which he did for the 1958 Brussels World's Fair. In this section of the mural, he used an elaborate line drawing of a baseball stadium across 7 panels as background for brown paper cutouts of a quarreling umpire, catcher, and pitcher directly at the center. As I wrote in my 2013 essay on this mural in connection with the Museum Ludwig's exhibition of the Americans, the mural is literally and figuratively about encounter, the aesthetic encounter of found objects and cutouts and paper with line drawings, and also the notion of contact between disparate elements, the meeting of Europeans with Americans. The mural is an autobiographical work about Steinberg's own experience of America, his adopted country, just as his 1954 Report for Life offers an immigrant's view of an American pastime. In 1959, Steinberg again utilized collage in inventive ways, this time for a corporate commission for an advertising brochure for Lincoln, and I am showing the first 5 pages of that booklet here. This brochure builds on his experience with the Brussels mural and broadens the boundaries of advertising. In contrast to the typical automobile advertisements of the period, which tend to highlight their own product in vibrant colors, variously emphasizing the experience of driving, the shiny exterior, or the vehicle's horsepower, in this campaign for Lincoln, the central image is of the competitor's car, composed of brown craft paper and black and white line drawings. The drawings span the fold of the brochure, crossing the natural, grainy, matte surface of the 2 cardboard cutouts, one of a fedora, the other a square tied with a string that boxes in a male figure. Steinberg effectively employs collage to represent the claustrophobic space of the competitor's car. Unlike the passengers riding in the Lincoln shown in the adjacent photographs at right, this unfortunate commuter shown at the center is cramped in the back seat and cannot stretch his legs or wear his hat. On the next page, Steinberg again uses collage to represent 3 figures crammed in a car interior. At the lower right, below the photograph, the text reads, "We regret that words and photographs are inadequate to convey the tremendous sense of well-being produced by Lincoln's solicitousness of your personal comfort." In a not-so-veiled jab at the field of photojournalism, this advertisement affirms the necessity of other media, in this case collage and drawing, to complete the story and to sell the car. Steinberg's collage not only brings visual variety to the brochure, it also assists the photograph and the text. But in the end, even that is not enough. The only way to really experience the spaciousness of a Lincoln is to test drive it yourself. This comment on the limitations of photography in the context of a car advertisement also participates in the larger debate on the relationship of words and pictures at the time. As Life magazine's picture editor, Wilson Hicks, described in his book, Words and Pictures of 1952, quote, "The intent of photojournalism is to create, through combined use of the dissimilar visual and verbal mediums, a oneness of communicative result. The basic unit of photojournalism is one picture with words." Hicks continues, "Often the photograph is not fully clear with respect to the what and raises doubt or conjecture as to the why or how. The writer identifies people, locales, objects, and establishes the relationships among them. He fixes the time of what is shown in the photograph. He confirms or corrects the reader's analysis of emotion and explains other obscurities. He supplies evidences of the other senses, sound, smell, taste, feel. The camera can just go so far. Words go the rest of the way." In this advertisement and the other collages for magazines discussed today, Steinberg bent the rules of photojournalism, taking on the role of both writer and artist, and mixed words and pictures. As we saw in his collages for Fortune, where he incorporated clippings of words, as well as in his other magazine works, where he used a range of methods, materials, and media. These works also stand on their own. They are not dependent on or merely illustrative of the adjacent text. As art historian H. Gombrich observed, Steinberg's drawings make their point so much better than words ever could. Steinberg's collages for magazines and advertisements are interactive, multisensory experiences that variously convey the cramped atmosphere of the interior of a car, a family's conversation on the draft, the emotional experience of listening to a soap opera on the radio, and the thrill of watching a baseball game in the stadium. Steinberg's incorporation of vernacular material in these magazine collages of the 1940s and 50s in order to celebrate or critique everyday life and current events also anticipates the magazine commissions of the late 1960s, such as Robert Rauschenberg's interactive foldout for Life magazine's 1965 issue on Dante, titled A Modern Inferno, and Romare Bearden's covers for Fortune and Time in 1968, the latter on which my fellow panelist Emily has written about. Commercial commissions are far too often viewed as mere side jobs to pay the bills and separate from a artist's fine art career. In the case of Saul Steinberg, however, magazine work played a key role in his development as an artist. Through these commissions, Steinberg collaborated with editors, photographers, writers, and printers, and encountered new media and technologies. These magazines provided a place where he could showcase new work and test out innovative concepts, which led to some of his most significant works of the post-war period. His experiments with reproductions on the printed page, for instance, prefigures his use of rubber stamps in later works, such as Konak, seen here on the right. And his diverse approaches to collage on the printed page certainly anticipate his monumental mural, The Americans, of 1958, as well as the paper bag masks of the late 1950s and early 60s. These varied and inventive magazine works not only challenge traditional accounts of art production and patronage in the United States, but also, like much of Steinberg's art, defies easy categorization. As Steinberg said in an interview published in Life magazine in 1965, quote, "I don't quite belong to the art, cartoon, or magazine world, so the art world doesn't quite know where to place me." The art world has not known where to place such magazine commissions either, and thus they have been largely left out of histories of modern and American art. Yet, I would argue, it is precisely because we don't quite know where to place them that makes them so central to the story. By blurring the boundaries of high and low, as well as the senses, Steinberg's magazine commissions and advertisements demonstrate the dynamic relationship between fine art and mass culture in the 20th century and reveal the messiness of modernism. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. That was great. Those were all wonderful papers. If we can bring all the panelists back on for video and unmuted. We have a number of questions. I thought I would start off with the following, though, just to try to link the three papers in this way. Maybe each of you could talk a little bit about the ways in which your artist, Hopper, Okubo, and Saul Steinberg, had agency at the particular magazines that they worked for. We've got some questions from some of the audience, for example. What kind of freedom did Hopper have at the magazines he worked for Wells Fargo in particular? And when we get to you, Melissa, and we see exactly what kind of freedom is going on here, what was it about some of the magazines that he's working for that encouraged that? There's so much experimentation going on. And Emily, I think that the question for you too is, why would Fortune in 1944 do something that is so ambivalent ultimately about what the nation has done in terms of Japanese American internment? So maybe we could get going with some great questions that we've got here in terms of just sort of sketching out what is the agency like for artists working for commercial commissions. Maybe Leo, you could start real quick.
Sure. Yeah, I saw Sarah Burns asked. That's a good question. The honest answer is that we don't really know, because there is remarkably little left, even in the Sanborn materials given to the Whitney a few years ago. There are a lot of materials in there, but we don't have correspondence between Hopper and Edward Hungerford, for example, and he's the one who called the shots. What I can tell you, though, is that what we do have in the Whitney are within the Hopper ledger books. There are, and I know, Erica, you've seen these as well. There are the amount of money, the date of his bill, invoices sent to publishing houses, and how much he gets and for what. What I can tell you about the Wells Fargo bills and what he charges, first of all, he gets between $10 and $15 for line illustrations. He gets between $25 and $50 for a cover, usually closer to 25. But what those records also tell us is that he's paid almost immediately from Wells Fargo. It's standard work. It's very much a business arrangement. I have a feeling that I imagine Hopper almost literally knocking on doors, being told what to do. My educated guess is that, in fact, he probably had some agency, but I have to temper that by saying that his hotel management covers look very similar to the ones that preceded it by Gordon Grant. Before he went to Wells Fargo Messenger, Earl Hoarder, the Philadelphia modernist artist collector. Hopper's illustrations are not that different from Earl Hoarder. My sense is that there was a company line, and I'm just sorry, Sarah Burns, that all I can tell you is about the regimentation of the company and the business, the no frills business relationship he had, that leads me to believe that he did not have a great deal of autonomy, unlike what I believe he did have autonomy for tavern topics and hotel management.
Okay. Emily, you want to pick up that stream of thought?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's interesting with the works that she was commissioned to do. She was told exactly what to do. She actually did illustrations for the December 1943 issue of Fortune as well. And she was told to paint Japanese soldiers and to show submission and ultimate surrender. So she was really, and I know from other artists anyway, that she was probably given very little time to do those 8 drawings. What's interesting with these is that she wasn't commissioned, so they couldn't control what she had drawn, but they could control how they framed it. And I think that that's where, if you get into an interesting tension between her agency and theirs, because they were using it to try, as part of their program, to sort of humanize Japanese Americans, as the war was coming to an end, and also trying to reframe them to meet their purposes.
but of course only so far by printing it on the the not great pages and sort of crammed into the bottom. I mean, they're clearly making choices as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Melissa, what do you think? What you're working with is far more experimental, but I have a bunch of questions about that as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of Saul Steinberg, what is so fascinating to me is what he's doing for all these different periodicals. So we're not looking at just what he did for Life or what he did for Fortune, and each of those editorial staffs would have been different. And I think it's also important just to recognize in general that there's not only networks that are bringing him to these projects, but he's also engaging and working with so many different people within the magazine. The one I find so fascinating is actually the one that's behind me too, for Vogue, and thinking about this as really an ephemeral work that he's just creating. And then he's working with a photographer to shoot it. And then someone else is going to lay this out. Someone else is going to write copy. Someone else is going to write a caption. And then that all comes together in what is kind of the final work of art, which in the end exists only as a reproduction on a printed page. So I do think there's a lot of different layers of agency that happen with it, but I also think it's specific to the periodical themselves. You know, when he's hired to do kind of a pictorial comment for Harper's, that's a very different project than being sent on the road with Life as an artist correspondent in the post-war period. And given the topic of baseball, I think that Life let him have a lot of freedom with that. Life didn't always let their artists have as much freedom, and sometimes they did and didn't, and really depended on the commission. So, and also, they also got many more works than they ever published. So an editor always selected out, well, these are the ones we're going to feature. And also sometimes things maybe that were initially intended as commissions ended up in speaking in pictures, or they ended up in different spots in the magazine, kind of like Emily's example. So I think there's a lot of levels that this operates on in the context of different publications in the post-war period, especially.
Have you come across any examples where what he produced was absolutely rejected?
Yes, actually. I have, and for this larger project, I have a wonderful letter that's from the Saul Steinberg papers, where he was rejected by Life a few years later for our project. And I actually still am kind of doing more research on what it was that he submitted, but didn't sound like they didn't like it. It just sounded like it wasn't going to work out for what they had planned. And that's another interesting facet. I mean, especially with Life, I can speak for, but I think with some of these other magazines, sometimes they don't get cut necessarily for their content. Maybe they just can't fit it into that issue, or something else happened in the world and they shift gears. So I've got to do more research in that. But yes, I have found an example of kind of, thanks for that idea, but we're not going to use it.
Well, the same was true with Life's photographers as well. So, but that's fascinating. I really appreciated you bringing in Rauschenberg as well, because as soon as I saw this, I thought 1954, this is when Rauschenberg is doing all of this as well. So that would be a nice thing to sort of connect up with.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we've got quite a few questions coming in. Maybe we can go back to some that have been asked about Hopper's work. John Ott makes the interesting observation about the subordinate sort of role or visualization that Hopper produces of Black porters, and makes the great connection between that and racial discrimination in the American banking and financial industries. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Leo, but if he had done otherwise.
As who had done otherwise?
If Hopper had painted it differently, perhaps.
Yeah, well, one of the things to remember about this is that not only is Jim Crow America not integrated, but Wells Fargo is absolutely not integrated. And it's always a little tough talking about some of these Hopper magazines, because we have to remember that these are trade publications. These are not intended for general readership. I think that I think these were morale boosting, consensus building publications. And if ever Wells Fargo was going to push any envelope, it wasn't going to be here. The purpose of Hopper's cover was to give an all business, pretty jingoistic magazine to make to lure the employee into picking it up and reading it. and giving them these reasons to feel good about being, well, let's face it, a white male employee at at Wells Fargo. Now this raises the question, well, what about the white women who appear as, I think that Wells Fargo there, quite frankly, with the Fargo girl, Erica, you and I have talked about Nell Brinkley. If you all don't know her, just type in your search window, Queen of Comics. You'll be glad you did. And Gibson and so many others. But I think that Wells Fargo is simply trying to seize on and further create a market for female customers purchasing traveler's checks. And this gets back to Sarah Burns's question. I think Hopper is told to toe a party line. You know, it's very frustrating because as you know, Erica, I know a lot more about some slightly later system, the business management magazine, or his work for hotel management. And we know less about these, but that's one of the reasons I find this very interesting. I think that absolutely Hopper would paint, and I think at this point he's illustrating a defensively white world.
Yeah, we had another question about the Wells Fargo way woman and the sense in which this is the 19 teens and we have sort of a suffrage era female traveler. And I mean, it's really interesting to think about what Wells Fargo and to a degree Hopper, the known misogynist, is painting this woman traveler and sort of giving her, with dog, etc., that sense of freedom because they acknowledge or understand the consumer power that they have. They're who's pulling the purse strings, etc. So I don't know where we could go with that, but I kept thinking as you were giving a really good paper, wow, these are so upbeat and positive about order and time and efficiency. And then you look at his paintings and they're so downbeat and time goes on forever. But the thing that carries through from the drawings and the ads to the paintings is this white culture, this emphasis on American whiteness, which I think people could continue to write about.
Yeah, I mean, it's the number of levels at which it's normative and like hegemonically enforcing. Wells Fargo, I don't want to go too deep in the rabbit hole in the weeds of Wells Fargo history because it's very tempting. But Wells Fargo is about to be told by the government to consolidate and join forces with other businesses. And Wells Fargo is looking for reassuring signs of racial normativity, of internal cooperation within the company. And I think the Wells Fargo Messenger, the message is to get along and not rock the boat.
Yeah.
I really believe that.
Okay.
And to perpetuate hierarchies that may not be part of the Wells Fargo way or the Wells Fargo, terminology, but Wells Fargo needs to have business as usual. They don't know what they're going to do about this stinking war.
Okay. Maybe we could return all four of us to this topic, which Emily proposed, of messy modernism. And the various ways in which all of you are contributing to this expanded, broadened understanding of what the modern is. Do you, in these three papers, see some similarities? Do you see some pretty big differences? What does modern mean? And how are our artists playing it out in the pages of these commercial commissions? Go ahead, Emily.
Well, yeah, I mean, this idea comes from, I think history affords you this 2020 vision, right? That you look back and you say, well, this artist was about this, and these times were about that. And one of the things that's interesting about these magazines is you see, oh my gosh, I never knew that this artist made this work of art for the first thing, or I've never heard of this artist, or I had no idea that this artist would accept a commission from a commercial, patron. And then you have the fact that within one publication, you have contradictory views, right? And
Right.
so it just, and it also, I mean, yeah, it raises questions about the sort of narrative you're told in throughout about art history sometimes, that there's some surprises. And I guess I think of, the artists who came after Okubo, who were, pretending not to be a part of the, focusing on pretending that they weren't responding to issues of the world, that was below art somehow. And it's the magazines make that impossible to sustain. I mean, people were constantly responding to their context, whether they talked about it or not. And many of those artists were actually making art for those magazines where the context is, like I say, impossible to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd also just add that I think modern magazines are central to the understanding of modernism. And I think especially in terms of their medium, they're extremely essential. It's this really important period of time where magazines are read by millions. They're really a central part of especially American 20th century print culture in this period. And I actually think the more I work on this, I'm actually less surprised to find out that all these artists wanted to work for magazines. Why wouldn't they want to work for magazines? Look what magazines are doing. Look how many people magazines are reaching. And I think that's something that the field itself has to kind of accept, is that it's really not that surprising that all these artists took on these corporate commissions and all these jobs and the opportunities that they afforded them. And I think that's really important to point out that it's not just a financial decision on the artist to take on these commissions, that there's a lot of other benefits and things that come out of these commissions. They're often also coming through really vast networks and international networks in some cases that are bringing these artists together to work on these really fascinating projects for these magazines, especially at mid-century.
I think that's a really good point. I think of Joseph Cornell's work with the dance magazines and the collage work that he's doing as well. And it's almost as if there's this space where they're afforded incredible experimentation, as you talked about. But what I just find amazing is that Life is literally giving away entire pages for this experimentation. Which is really generous when you think about it. And that he at the same time, with that wonderful Christmas tree design that he puts together, is forcing the reader to be more than a reader, right? It's about looking, it's kind of like trying to read graphic novels when you're used to just, going through your iPad and all of a sudden, these images pop up. It's challenging. And I think audiences sponge onto it very quickly. I think they're delighted with it. So
Yeah.
And sorry, Erica, just to build on what you just said too about the Christmas tree and the engaging aspect, I noticed a question came in from someone on the chat, Roger Crum, and he was asking about the viewing angle and of holding a magazine. And I certainly think that Steinberg was thinking about that. Because if you think about the way that you have to hold the magazine for all these things to work, and the fact that he often draws people looking at papers and looking at magazines within these drawings, he's certainly thinking about, well, you sit in a chair and you read your newspaper, or you sit and you rest it on your lap, or you put your elbow here when you hold it. So I certainly think that, at least in the case of Steinberg, he's also thinking about, how do I engage with paper? How do I hold this object in my hand? How do I flip the page? And then how do I design this so that it works in that context?
That's such an important point. It's not about looking on the wall. It's not like looking at the television screen. I recently did a life-related assignment in one of my classes, and the students were just almost befuddled by the size and weight of the magazine. I made each one of them go find a 1950s Life. And they ended up saying, well, I either had to put it out on a table or I gave up and put it on the floor. And I thought, well, yeah, that's how I used to read Life magazine. You just kind of laid down on the floor and looked at it, which is very, very, as several of you said, experiential. This is about feeling and looking and reading all at the same time. And I think that's what makes this so incredibly successful as part of, the modernist strategy. But, and Emily, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to build on what Melissa was saying. I think you're absolutely right. You know, many artists were more than okay with accepting these commissions. And I think, you know, we need to, as historians, get over whatever hangups we might have and be okay with looking at this venue seriously, right? Because many of them did do as well.
But as you know, that's hard. This requires hours and days of research going through boxes or trying to find full runs of the magazine so you can get a really expanded overview. I don't think it's hard. It requires a lot of work, of looking. It's exhausting, but I think it requires a certain almost, you know, systematic sensibility. This isn't about single works. This is about commissions and relationships and you know, team playing and things getting rejected all the time. It's complicated and it's interesting.
Well, you know, I have to say though, I think that there's a lot that is modernist about Hopper's illustrations. And while I'm very proud to participate in this, I have to say, and who doesn't love an alliterative title, right? Messy modernism. Edward Hopper was many things, but messy is not one of them.
Right.
And so, you know, it's a little tough. What I would say, this whole affective experiential modernism that we're talking about, a lot of people who do that, it seems that the genesis of that, one of the origins is Daniel Joseph Segal's, that early essay towards the definition of American modernism, where he talks about expression and experience and juxtaposition of opposites as being an ends in their own right. And certainly that's part of what makes our cast of characters modernist. I would say that in Wells Fargo Messenger, Hopper is a very restrictive modernist. I mean, it's who gets to feel in the first place, who gets to hold the mic.
Yeah, that's true. This is corporate modernism, you know.
Yeah, and it's modernism in the, you know, I mean, 20th century art history is full of examples of things looking loosey goosey, but actually serving a greater cause. And Hopper's free-flowing travelers are, you know, they're in neat single file lines.
Good point. Yeah. Let's see. Do you all have any questions for us, for one another? That was so articulate. I'm trying to think what else I've got. No dead air. Come on, guys.
I see a question in from Jennifer Greenhill that I think kind of builds on what we were just talking about as well. If we may want to discuss that as a panel.
Sure. So Jennifer writes, I'm thinking about the idea that Steinberg turned the magazine page into a venue for art. I wonder if framing the panel in terms of modernism potentially restricts how we understand art to take shape within the material context of magazines. Are there any examples or details in your current research that you don't quite know what to do with and don't fit the categorization or the categories we tend to use to make sense of visual expression? And I would add modern visual expression. And yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. But my pushback to what you're saying, Leo, would be, I think that there are lots of different kinds of modernism. And I think that Hopper is in on it. And then one of the things he'll do is he feels badly about his corporate work, right? He doesn't want to talk about it. And yet we know that he appropriates the subjects and appropriates the images and creates a very, very different sort of emotional tenor in the paintings that he ultimately develops. And, you know, whether that's his version of the modern versus the corporate version of efficiency and time labor and all of the things that you're talking about, they're still part of the whole.
So you're saying you don't see it as quite as restrictive a modernism as I'm suggesting it is, or?
Oh, I think that he's Of the three artists that we're talking about today, he is the most restricted, but it's also the time period that he's working. And Steinberg is probably, and certainly what happens to Okubo later, is the most liberated or able
Good
to
point, yeah.
play with. But then that's also Hopper, right?
It's also Hopper, and in 1936, Joe Hopper famously compared Hopper's attitude towards illustration to doing the dishes. But it was in her interest to do that,
Sure.
because remember that, of course, he's surrounded by partisan advocates like Guy Pen Dubois, later Fairfield Porter, Lloyd Goodrich, obviously, who want you to think of, remember Hopper comes of age really in the age of surrealism and AbX. I mean, 1940, early mid 40s.
By coming of age, you mean he becomes popular?
Well, meaning his critical fortunes,
Yeah.
come of age.
Right.
And I think that he wants to say, hey, listen, damn it, I've been thinking about death since 4 this morning too. Take me seriously. And I think I agree with what you're saying. It's a good warning, but I would only add, Erica, that a lot of the attitudes that we attribute to Hopper about his work, whether he really liked it or not, I don't know. He won awards for it.
Yep.
He goes back to it again and again, even when he's selling paintings. And I think that a lot of times, I think we can all be guilty of conflating Hopper's attitudes towards illustration with, that famous essay that you and I both know, To Personalize the Rain Pipe, about Hopper's critical fortunes, and about Goodrich, advancing him as this masculine, exceptional guy. I think that I think that a lot of things that we think are Hopper's ideas, I think he relies on, I'm not saying he's just a screwed up guy, but I think he has the curator and then director of the Whitney helping him along. And I think a lot of times what we're looking at are very heavily vetted statements about illustration and painting.
Yeah. Well, I think what he says is often as tight as what he paints.
Well said, yeah.
Very different from what Steinberg does, and
Totally.
what Okubo is striving for. What she's aspiring towards. So, yeah. We have just a couple of minutes left.
I actually am curious. I know you were saying, it can be hard to go get those magazines. In my case, it's becoming impossible. All of the magazines are being taken into storage, deep storage, and because it's all available online. But the Fortune Archive online is, it's completely subpar because you can't see the spreads, and a lot of things are missing, etc. It's helpful sometimes, but it's just not the same. You don't get that material aspect. So I guess it's just maybe, I don't know, I think it might be something that everyone could speak to, that material aspect of the magazine, what we lose. We talked a little bit about that, what we lose by having just a screen now, and other media sources. And also just, I'm kind of curious what your experiences have been in your own research in dealing with these things as paper objects or, images on a screen.
Such a good question. I think a lot of people are simply afraid of delving into this because it's complicated. But yeah, Melissa, Leo, what have been your experiences? I mean, if anybody wants to work on Life, all of its, the 4 billion boxes from the Time Life archives are available through the New York Historical Society. What a wonderful thing that is. There's a lot to do with those magazines. The Fortune materials too, but
in the case of Hopper, it's pretty frustrating. In the exhibition at Edward Hopper in the American Hotel, there's not one but 2 hotel trade magazines Hopper worked for: Tavern Topics, Hotel Management. They're all bound in what are like big city phone books. We could only get, as you know, Erica, because you saw the show, we could only get detached images from one library. MIT libraries have them non-bound. Who knew? And so, it's very, very hard to do that. The magazines exist, but as I mentioned earlier, correspondence from Hopper. We have a lot of helpful correspondence, from people like Edward Hungerford. The main thing with Hopper is just Hopper studies, it's kind of tough. I mean, a lot of people, there have been a lot of Hopper exhibitions that just, until fairly recently, that are otherwise outstanding, but I just don't think have really made much use of the illustrations. They just view them as a pot boiling exercise that Hopper had to exorcise from himself until he, you know.
Yeah, we also simply do not have access to full runs of these in-house magazines so that we can actually see how big they were, I mean, some of them ran a couple hundred pages an issue, and they're full of ads, and they're full of really interesting letters. They really give you insight, but finding them is a trick, and then finding them so you can really feel the weight.
Well, you know, the
Yeah.
physicality, the sheer physicality, I hate to say the haptic idea, the experience of holding it and feeling it in your hands. Getting back to something that I think Roger Crumb said, you know, this raises some interesting ideas. I think that more painters, in the artists, in the messy modernist rubric we have here, thought about the experience than we may realize, of spreading out on your floor and looking and holding it up and looking at it. I think physicality and the role of touch and holding in possession the physical thing and its weight. Forum is a big weighty magazine, you know. It has heft. And I think that studies in this area should talk a little bit more, much as Jeffrey Batchen has talked about the physicality of handling photographs. I feel like maybe it's time for us to apply a similar method to our handling of the Modernist magazine.
Yeah, good point. So, Stephanie, where are we for time? Oh, we're almost done, aren't we?
Yeah, well, you know, I have to thank all of you for your exceptional presentations. They were absolutely fascinating. And we thank you so much for advancing the conversation about illustration and the importance of published imagery and how we experience it. So thank you, Erica, Melissa, Emily, and Leo. Fantastic evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will look forward to seeing you soon. This summer, we'll have a number of really interesting programs in relation to our upcoming exhibition, which is Enchanted, A History of Fantasy Illustration. So we'll look forward to seeing you soon, and we hope you all stay well. Thanks again for a fabulous event. We really
Thanks for
appreciate it.
hosting this, Stephanie. And thanks to the museum.
Thanks.
So, bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, everybody. Thanks so
all.
much.
See you soon.